Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Plummer. This episode is the third in a three-part series on libertarian views of free will. Today, we will cover non-causal libertarianism.
And our guest in this episode is David Palmer. And as always, please submit your questions through our website, thefreewillshow.com, or through social media at The Free Will Show. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce David Palmer, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Tennessee. David is the editor of a book called Libertarian Free Will, Contemporary Debates, which was published in 2014 by Oxford University Press. And he's published many articles on free will and moral responsibility, including a forthcoming article on a non-causal approach to free will and control, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in the episode. So welcome to the show, David. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's good to be involved. As about my approach to coming into philosophy, I was actually a psychology major in undergrad. So I didn't take any philosophy classes in college. But I came to it, I remember the date quite particularly. I was taking a cognitive psychology class, and we were discussing psychological experiments about memory. Short-term memory versus long-term memory, and the different experiments showing how much capacity the short-term versus long-term memory had. And it's funny, throughout that whole class, a basic question kept bothering me. So I went to the psychology professor's office hours and told him there was a question that just kept nagging at me the whole semester, which is that while I now knew the size of long-term versus short-term memory, we hadn't answered a more basic question, which was just, what does it mean to remember something? That is the notion of memory itself. That was something that we hadn't talked about. And there was a pause, I guess a pregnant pause in the office. And the psychology professor looked at me, shook his head, almost disappointed, and said, "I think you're a philosopher. I think you're a philosopher." That meant nothing to me because I'd never taken a philosophy class before. But after that, I went to philosophy and became gripped by it. Been here ever since. I got my PhD at Texas and have been teaching here at the University of Tennessee ever since. As to my particular research and teaching interests, as you mentioned, I've worked a lot on topics about free will and action more generally. I think the main theme that animates my research and teaching is this, and this comes from the question about memory I had way back when, which is that we seem to have two different pictures, and the issue is how they fit together. So on the one hand, we have a particular understanding of ourselves, we human beings, and on the other hand, we have a particular understanding of everything else in the world. And these two pictures don't always seem like they fit together particularly well. So in terms of free will, we have a picture of ourselves as creatures that are able to choose between alternatives. We have the freedom to choose between alternatives, whether it's something mundane as choosing between tea or coffee, choosing between different jobs you might be offered. But on the other hand, we have this view about everything else in the world that doesn't seem to have a choice about what it does. Anytime a ball is dropped, it's just going to fall, all else being equal. It doesn't have a choice about what it does in the way that we do. And so I think the central theme for me, which is why free will is quite a nice issue in this respect, is how we bring together those two pictures. I guess how we see ourselves as both different from the world, from other things in the world, but also as a part of it at the very same time.
Yes.
Well, in the first season of the Free Will Show, we discussed several arguments for incompatibilism, in particular the consequence argument and the manipulation argument. Do you take either of these arguments to be successful, or is there some other reason that you think free will is incompatible with determinism?
I think both of those arguments are highly suggestive. I think the issue from the non-causal perspective, the view that we'll discuss today, is this. Both of those arguments, suppose they're sound, what would they establish? They'd establish that free will is incompatible with determinism. Would that by itself, though, establish the non-causal position, which is the view perhaps that free actions must be uncaused? Maybe not, because even if free will were incompatible with determinism, it still might be compatible with some kind of causation, just not deterministic causation.
Yeah.
So it's interesting in this sense when we're thinking about the traditional arguments for incompatibilism, as you mentioned the two. Non-causalists almost have a higher burden here, a harder thing to show. They have to show not only that free will is incompatible with determinism, but also that's incompatible with causation at all. And I think that's quite hard to do. I mean, if you think about looking at the way that non-causalists tend to write, here's the way they tend to think about it. They may not come at it from the perspective of those two traditional arguments you mentioned. Perhaps they come at it from a slightly different perspective. And it might be something like this. Just begin thinking about a mundane choice. We mentioned it before, the choice between picking tea or coffee at a coffee shop, something simple like that. A lot of philosophy just begins in intuition, just begins in self-reflection, right, as a starting point, not as the ending point, but as the starting point. So if you just imagine yourself just there in the coffee shop, should I pick tea? Should I pick coffee? And suppose you take yourself to a freely chosen coffee. You make the coffee choice, you take yourself to freely chosen it. Question, on the face of it, does it seem as if anything caused you to make that choice? I think a lot of people would say no, it doesn't seem like anything caused us to make that choice. Here's what it seems like instead. There were certain reasons for the coffee choice, certain reasons for the tea choice, and in the light of those reasons, you made the choice. Nothing caused you to make the choice. You just made it in the light of the reasons that you had. I mean, that's only going to be a starting point. Then you might say this is perhaps the second step from the non-causal approach. You might say, well, okay, let's just suppose that the choice you made, the coffee choice, it may not have seemed caused to you, but let's just suppose that it were. So suppose the choice for coffee was caused by something. Well, it could have been caused in one or two ways, either deterministically or indeterministically. Suppose first that it were caused deterministically. What does that mean? Well, it means that given that cause happened, it was always going to cause the coffee choice. There's no way in which it could have caused anything else. So a sort of way to think about this is just imagine rewinding time just prior to the choice, to when the cause occurs, press play. Everything else would have unfolded exactly the same way if the cause were deterministic, and it would have caused exactly the same choice, the coffee choice. Once you think that, you then start to think, well, hang on a second, how could the choice have been up to me? It didn't seem like it was up to me if it were deterministically caused. Rather, it seems like it was actually up to the cause. It was in the cause's hands what choice I would have made. And then the other option, of course, is to say, well, perhaps the way around this is to say there's a bit of flexibility in what choice the cause would cause. It was probabilistic or indeterministic. So on this view, although the coffee choice was caused, the causation wasn't deterministic. It instead was indeterministic or probabilistic. Does that help? Does that make it seem like the choice could be up to me? From the non-causal perspective, it seems not, because from the non-causal perspective, it still seems like whether or not the cause was deterministic or indeterministic, the choice, the thing caused, wouldn't have been up to me. And again, a way to think about this, in the indeterministic case, rewind time to when the cause was occurring, press play, obviously it's hypothetical, press play. Everything else would have proceeded as normal, except at least in some of these rewound scenarios, what would have happened if the cause were indeterministic? Here's what would have happened. The other choice would have been caused instead, the T choice. So in a certain percentage of them, the T choice would have been caused. In a certain other percentage of them, the coffee choice would have been caused. And then it seems quite clear, well, it's not up to me as the chooser which one was caused. Rather, it was up to what? Up to the prior cause which one was caused. So in both cases, whether the cause was deterministic or indeterministic, the intuition, at least for the non-causalist, is going to be that it wasn't up to me, the chooser, whether I made the coffee choice or the tea choice. Rather, it was in the hands of the prior cause which one was chosen. there aren't a lot of non-causalists.
Right.
It's a minority view. It's actually trying to find a good argument in favor of the non-causal position. That is the incompatibility of free will and causation, as opposed to the incompatibility of free will and determinism, is tough.
Right.
A lot of it is just taken, when, at least by my reading of it, a lot of the key figures, they begin from this sort of intuitive perspective, which is that it just doesn't seem like when we're acting freely, choices are caused. Mm-hmm. Feels like nothing causes me to do it. I have reasons to do it, and then I just sort of pick. And then you sort of add in, well, what would it be like if it were caused? And then you think, well, hang on a second, if it were, it wouldn't be up to me. Mm-hmm. But it is up to me, which I pick. So what? Well, must be uncaused.
Yeah. I could see somebody arguing for the no free will position with the same kind of evidence, and them saying, well, it seems like you make a choice. But when we think about how our brains work, we can see that our decisions are actually caused by brain states. And so that just means with the same evidence, we come to the conclusion that nobody really has free will, or it's the choices we make aren't as they seem.
Yeah, good. Actually, that's a great point. Suppose it turns out, I mean, this is one of the hard burdens of the non-causal libertarian view. Libertarian in the sense that it affirms free will. We really do sometimes act freely. Suppose it just turns out that when contemporary brain science is finished, or even now, at best, contemporary brain science shows us that our choices are caused. Perhaps it doesn't tell us whether they're caused deterministically or indeterministically, but at least it tells us that they're caused. Now, what is the non-causal libertarian supposed to do? Well, it looks like they have to give up something. The natural thing to do, I suppose, is to give up the libertarian aspect and to become, as you suggested, become a free will skeptic and to say, well, look, from the reflections that I just suggested, that is what it seems like to me, and then how the presence of a causal factor would seem to undermine the actions being up to me. All that is compatible with free will skepticism, isn't it? The idea that we really don't have free will. If it turns out, in fact, that our actions are in fact caused. In that way, though, I think any libertarian view is kind of making a bet with contemporary science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
So is this a particular weakness, that the issue you're making, the issue you pointed out nicely, to the non-causal view as opposed to other libertarian views? Perhaps not. It might be if we're more inclined to think that contemporary science tells us that actions are caused per se in some way, because, of course, that's what the non-causalist denies. But I think that's a great point. I do think that's a great point. From my own view, suppose it turns out, to borrow a well-known, or to change, I should say, a well-known thought experiment from John Martin Fisher. Suppose you were to wake up one morning and read in the New York Times that scientists have proven, to a degree we're all confident in, that all of our actions are in fact caused. I would personally then become a free will skeptic. I would say, well, it turns out that I thought I had free will, but in fact I don't, because of the considerations we discussed previously.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, we'll turn to a couple more objections to the view in a minute, but I thought it would be worth asking here for you to contrast the non-causal libertarian position with the other types of libertarianism that we've already had episodes on. So in the last two episodes, we've talked about event causal and agent causal forms of libertarianism. Could you say a little bit about how the non-causal libertarian view differs from these other views?
Yeah, good. So let's start with the event causal view. So on the event causal libertarian view, when a person acts, of course, they're all libertarian views. They all affirm that free will exists. What does it take for a person to act freely? On the event causal view, for a person to act freely is for her action to be caused indeterministically, rather than deterministically, by prior events or states of her. So typically by psychological states of her, events that she's the subject of. So, for example, in the tea or coffee case, what it would be for a person to act freely in picking the coffee, say, would be for the event of her wanting the coffee, her desire to cause indeterministically her choice. That position has real attractions to it. We tend to think that other causation in the world between inanimate objects is of that type, is event-event causation. Now, of course, we say such things like, the ball caused the window to break, the ball being a thing. But on closer inspection, we don't really mean that. What we tend to think we mean is some event involving the ball. For instance, the ball's hitting the window with a certain velocity, with a certain force. That event is what caused the window to break, not the ball per se. And so the event causal view is nice because it seems to respect the idea that free will doesn't require any special kind of causation that's any different from the causal behavior of other objects in the world. That's the difference between that and the agent causal view. Traditionally, the agent causal view posited a special or unique kind of causation for human free actions that was different from the kind of event causation at issue in the ball causing the window to break case. On the agent causal view, when a person acts freely, for instance, she freely chooses to pick coffee at the coffee shop, what happens is that she herself, as a substance, as an enduring thing, causes her action or her decision. It's not by way of being the subject of any event or any mental state. Just her as a thing, she causes it as a substance. Then you come to the final position, the topic for today, which is the non-causal libertarian position. On this view, as it's usually understood, we'll make a distinction in a moment. In order for a person to act freely, her action cannot be caused at all, either by her as a substance or by any event or state that she's involved in. I say there's a couple of distinctions here because you might distinguish a couple of different distinctions we can make here. Some non-causal libertarians suggest that the thing that is that must be uncaused is not a person's free action, but rather her action per se. So on that view, all actions, in all events, in order for them to be actions, must be uncaused. Not just in order for a person to act freely, the action must be uncaused. I don't tend to like that view myself. I tend to prefer to allow that actions per se could be caused. It's just that in order for them to be free, they must be uncaused.
Yeah.
Then the other distinction that's sometimes made among non-causal libertarians is a sort of weak, strong distinction. The position I've been suggesting, which is that in order for a person to act freely, her action must be uncaused, is a kind of strong view because it cannot be caused if it's going to be free. Other non-causalists are perhaps a slightly more weaker view. They say, well, in order for a person's action to be free, it could be caused indeterministically, but it needn't be caused. So that's a slightly weaker view. It allows that an action could be, say, indeterministically caused, as an event causalist might propose, but also it would still be free if it were uncaused. The view that we've been discussing so far, I think, has taken that stronger view, which is that in order for an action to be free, it must be uncaused, such that if it were caused in any way, it wouldn't be free at all.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to talk about some objections to the non-causal view. In season 1, we had an episode on the problem of luck, and we were discussing with Al Mealy this view of the non-causal view of free will. And he claimed that he can't even make sense of an uncaused action. He thinks that they're impossible in his view. And the argument that he came up with, or at least the motivation for thinking that it's hard to understand how actions could be uncaused, came from Donald Davidson. And Al's gloss on the argument was something like this: consider doing something for a reason. So imagine that a person has two different reasons for performing some action, but the person only does it for one of the reasons. And the example that he gave was like the action is mowing your lawn. And let's suppose that the two reasons for mowing your lawn are convenience and revenge. Because your neighbor had mowed the lawn really early in the morning. And so you want to mow the lawn really early in the morning to get back at her, to get vengeance. But it's also convenient because you can get on with the rest of your day. So you have these two reasons. And we're told by somebody who apparently knows somehow that the person mowed their lawn for only one of these reasons, and that one of the reasons was among the causes of the action and the other one wasn't. And then the question is, well, did he do it for the reason that is among the causes of the action or for the one that wasn't.
Mm.
So what do you make of this objection to the non-causal theory of action?
I think it's a strong objection, and I think it's tough for non-causalists to respond to, because what's nice about that Davidson idea is this sort of stuff seems to happen to us all the time, where we do something, for instance, mow the lawn, and we seem to have two reasons, if you like, two reasons in our head that could be reasons for which we do it. As you said there, one of the reasons might be convenience, to get it done early so we can carry on with our day. And the second reason might be also we're slightly annoyed at our neighbor for waking us up. So the second reason would be for revenge, to wake up our neighbor, just like they did to us. Both of those reasons, as it were, are kind of in our heads at the moment. But it does seem like, as you said, we just do it for one of them, at least on some occasions, rather than the other. And what's the natural way to understand what it is to do it for one of those reasons rather than the other? The natural way to understand it, as Davidson and as Mealy suggest, is this. Well, it's just that one of those reasons caused the action and the other didn't. Now, what can the non-causalist say? Well, if the non-causalist allows that, then he'll have to say that the action wasn't free because it was caused, which doesn't seem that right, because, of course, it seems to be a paradigmatic free action. Yeah. So let's just work with the example. So suppose what's happened is the reason for which you actually did it was to exact revenge. You had the other reason for convenience. You wanted to get it done early so you could get on with your day, but that wasn't the reason for which you did it. So just suppose the fact of the matter is that you did it because you wanted to get back at your neighbor for revenge. The non-causalist then can't do what Davidson is inviting us and Mealy is inviting us to do. They can't say, it's because that reason to exact revenge is what caused our action. What they've got to do then is to say, well, there's some other relation here. There's some other relation between the action and that reason that doesn't obtain between that action and the second reason. What relation might that be? The standard response here by non-causalists is to say that relation is not going to be a causal relation, but rather a teleological relation, where a teleological relation here is going to say something like this. What makes it the case that I mowed the lawn in order to exact revenge rather than for convenience is that I wanted to do it in order to achieve that goal of exacting revenge. It's precisely in order to achieve that goal, in order to exact revenge, rather than in order to finish early and be convenient, that explains why I did it for the one reason rather than the other. Now, and according to the non-causalist, these sort of teleological explanations, these goal-oriented explanations that I did the thing in order to achieve a certain goal rather than to achieve a different goal, those are not causal in character. So just to give another example of how this works, or at least how it's supposed to work, suppose I'm just waving my hand, and it could be for one of two reasons, either because there's a friend I'm trying to alert her attention, but it's also because my hand is asleep and I want to wake it up. Both of those reasons. Suppose the reason I actually do it for is to alert my friend. As it happens, it will also wake up my hand because it's fallen asleep, but that's not the reason for which I did it. Well, what explains why I did it for the one reason and not the other on this approach, this teleological approach? The answer is this, that I did it in order to attract my friend's attention. I didn't do it in order to wake up my hand, albeit it did that by waking up, by moving my hand. I did wake it up from its sleep state, but I didn't do it in order to do that. So this in order to is the teleological explanation, something that's not causal, according to the non-causalist. Now, there's a problem here. Mealy and Davidson will probably reply as follows to these sorts of accounts. They'll say things like, "Well, hang on, what is this in order to explanation? Can you give it a philosophical analysis?" It almost feels like we're just putting a label on something that we want to understand rather than providing an analysis. And there are a few analyses of what this amounts to in non-causal vocabulary, but perhaps the standard thing that non-causalists do here is to say, this sort of teleological explanation, this I did X in order to achieve Y type explanation, is something you can't analyze. It's basic. That's just where the analysis finishes. Now, whether you find that satisfactory or not, it'll depend on where you fall on this. But I will say this, that even causal analyses of these kinds of phenomena, as you know, a lot of philosophers, when they're analyzing causation, especially in the free will literature, they take causation itself to be a basic relation, something that can't be explained in more simple relations. If you hold that view about causation, as many philosophers do, then if it's okay to hold that view about causation, I think it should be okay to hold that view about teleological explanations too. I mean, there's another issue with the Mealy point, which I think also hits home and will hit home with many listeners. You mentioned Mealy's suggestion here that the idea of an uncaused action is just hard to wrap your head around. It's hard to make sense of. It almost seems impossible. And I certainly feel that as someone that's interested in the non-causal view. Partly why I'm interested in it is to see what sense we can make of that. Because it's as if this, suppose our actions were uncaused. Here's a way of thinking about it. It makes it seem as if they just happen out of the blue, out of nowhere. And we don't tend to think anything in the world operates like that. I mean, there's that old adage, isn't there? Everything happens for a reason. Everything has an explanation. Everything has an explanation. But if actions were uncaused, it feels like they just wouldn't have an explanation. They would just sort of happen at the snap of a finger. And not only does that seem incompatible with acting freely, it just seems incompatible with how we understand the rest of the world. Now, of course, what a lot of non-causalists want to say here as well, it is true that perhaps every event has an explanation, but it's just not true that every event has a causal explanation, because there are other kinds of explanations out there. True, while for a lot of events in the world that are not actions, their explanation will be causal in character. Why is it that the light goes on when I flip a switch? Well, it's because I caused it to go on by moving an electric circuit. Why is it the window breaks when a ball is thrown at it? Because there's going to be a causal explanation. But when it comes to human actions on the non-causal view, there's still an explanation of why they occur. It's just not going to be a causal one. Rather, it's going to be teleological in character in the way that we just discussed.
Right. That's actually a great segue into the next question we wanted to ask, because you might think, well, I have control over whether my light's on because I can cause the lights to turn on by flipping the switch. And there's causal connections between all those events, or maybe substances, what have you. But it seems harder to make sense of how an agent could have control over at least her basic actions, maybe her mental actions of making a choice, making a decision. Hard to make sense of how there could be any control in coming to a decision if there's no causal, if the decision itself is uncaused. So I mentioned at the beginning this paper you've recently written on this kind of control objection to non-causal libertarianism. How would you answer this objection that the non-causalist can't really make sense of control?
I think it's really powerful, and it's hard to know what to say from a non-causal perspective, because I think you're exactly right that for a lot of events in the world that we think we have control over, we think we have control over them by virtue of causing them. I mean, I just mentioned, making the light go on in my house. How do I do that? I have control over whether the light goes on by causing it to go on. How do I cause it to go on? By flipping the switch. If I'm driving a car down the road and I want the car to go left, to take a left turn, how do I have control over whether the car goes to the left? Well, I have control over that by causing it to go left, namely by steering the wheel and therefore causing the tires to move to the left and the car to go that way. On that basis, it seems we'll just now move to the question of control over human action and decision. The natural thing then to say is, well, the way we have control over our own actions and our own decisions is similarly by causing them, which, of course, the non-causalist can't allow. So that's the force of the objection. My sense in response to this is to concede that, yes, I do think it's right that when it comes to other events in the world besides human actions, we have control over them by causing them. Because these are events, of course, that are outside our own skin. The movement of the car is outside my own skin. The coming on of the light in my house is something outside of my own skin. So when it comes to events that are outside my own skin, outside my own body, I think it sounds right to say we have control over them by causing them. But when it comes to events, by contrast, that are within my own skin, within my own body, our movements, our decisions, our choices, how do we have control over them? And in particular, do we have to cause them? And my sense here is perhaps not. I mean, the suggestion I've been thinking about and working through is this. Just go back to the case I keep referring to, choosing between tea and coffee in a cafe. Suppose you choose coffee and you think it's a free choice. You think you had control over whether you chose tea. What would it take for you to have control over whether you chose that, whether you made that choice? Well, suppose nothing else has control over whether you caused it, over whether you chose it. Mm-hmm. There's no one sort of in the background messing around with you, interfering with you in any way. Suppose nothing else had control over whether you chose it. What would it take for you to have control over whether you chose it? I think the answer is just that you made the choice. All it takes for you to have control over what you do, if nothing else has control over whether you do it, is just simply for you to perform the action or make the decision. In other words, control doesn't require some additional factor. It doesn't require some additional thing that you need to be able to have or to exercise in order to make the choice. Again, on the assumption that nothing else has control over what you do and over the choices that you make. And arguably, if the choice you make were uncaused, then nothing else would have control over it, precisely because there'd be no cause there. If there were a cause there, perhaps it would have control over it. But if there were no cause present, you just made the choice, then it wouldn't have control over whether you did it. So what else would be needed in order for you to have control over whether you did it? It just seems like the answer is, as it were, nothing. You should just simply perform the action or make the choice. And it's in performing the action or in making the choice that you exercise control over the choice that you made. And one way of thinking about this, I suppose, is it's quite a deflationary position. Mm-hmm. If you think about the causalist perspective, the perspective seems to be, well, in order for a person to have control over what she does, something else needs to be true of her. She needs to cause it in some way. From a non-causal perspective, I think that we're being more deflationary and we're thinking, actually, nothing else needs to be true from her point of view. So long as nothing else is in control of the choice, then she's in control of it just by virtue of making it. What else would need to be true of her? What else would need to be true of her in order to have control over whether she made it? The answer, I think, seems to be nothing. I shall take the stony silence as being utterly convinced by my compelling arguments there. That's great. That's great. I mean, I'm still thinking through all this stuff. That was the basic line I suggested in that paper. This sort of, I guess it's a kind of deflation. I didn't quite put the word deflationary in the paper, but talking to people, they've put it that way. But I do think it's right, because if nothing's making you do it, if not just whether it's a choice or a physical action, if nothing outside of you is making you do it, if nothing inside of you is making you do it, then what does it take for you to have control over it? The answer seems to be nothing. You just do it. Mm-hmm. What would undermine your control would be the presence of other stuff having control over it. But if that's absent, then all that you need to do to have control over it is just do the thing. Wave your arm, make the tea choice, whatever the candidate phenomenon is. At least that was my sense. What do you guys make of it?
So I wanted to ask about what other thing controlling your action you think we're sort of setting aside or saying isn't the case when you have control over your uncaused action. So we talked about manipulation arguments in season 1. So clearly, well, I think you would say this, clearly if someone else is causally determining you to act in a certain way, that's going to take away your control because, well, on the one hand, it's caused, but also it's caused by some other person who has control over your behavior, maybe. But do you think just any sort of causal influence, if your action's caused at all, that's just going to take away your control? Are you opting for the strong view that you?
Yes, I do. I think that kind of fits with the sort of positive suggestion to thinking that the non-causal view is true that we sketched out earlier, which is that if the action were caused, whether deterministically or indeterministically, then it feels like who's in control of the action? Well, it feels like the prior cause. It's in the prior cause's hands, whether you did it rather than you as the agent. I think that intuition is one that the non-causalist takes very, very seriously, that if your actions were caused deterministically or indeterministically, then whether the action occurred wasn't in your hands. Rather, it was in the hands of the prior cause.
Mm-hmm.
It was either 100% in the prior cause's hands if the causation were deterministic, or if the causation were indeterministic, then it's true, it's a matter of probability whether it causes the one action or the other. But in either way, it's still in that prior cause's hands as opposed to yours, whether the action occurs. Now, if the action were uncaused, and so it was in no one else's or nothing else's hands, whether the action occurs, then its occurrence would be in your hands just by default, just by virtue of you doing it. That's all it would take for you to have control over it, is just for you to perform it. At least that's I think the key intuition among non-causalists.
Well, maybe to go back to the problem of luck that we've talked about in the last couple of episodes and in the episode with Al Mealy in season 1. So one way of putting the problem of luck is if we're building indeterministic causation into our picture of libertarian agency, there's one world where the agent, she makes one decision, but it's caused by either the agent or by prior states involving the agent. But in another world where everything was the same right up until that time, different choice was caused. Do you think there's not really a problem here for the non-causalists because the action isn't caused in either of the possible scenarios? You could make the choice to have coffee, you could make the choice to have tea, but either way, it's not going to be caused. I still feel some sense that it's not really up to the agent. It sort of feels random.
Good. You anticipated what I would say about that. Perhaps an odd way of thinking about it, I think the non-causalist has a nice response to that luck objection. I think the luck objection really raises its head when you think the action was caused. And almost there's a kind of luck objection whether the thing is caused deterministically or indeterministically, because in either sense, who is it up to, or what is it up to, whether the action occurred? It's up to the cause, not up to you. And again, it's this deflationary response, because I do concede, and I do feel the sense you're suggesting that, well, suppose the action were uncaused. Does it feel like it could be up to the person? Does it feel like it could be up to the agent? And one wants to say no. Why? Because in order for it to be up to her, what must be true? She must cause it. Well, here's a way of thinking about it. Just hypothetically, suppose most of our actions at the times we think we act freely are uncaused. We don't know that to be true, but let's just suppose that's true hypothetically. Would that give us any reason to think that our actions, on the face of it, weren't up to us? I don't think it would. I think we would still think our actions are up to us. Just by virtue of doing them, by performing them, we wouldn't feel like we lacked control over them. By contrast, if our actions were caused, suppose they were caused indeterministically, then, as you said, in some scenarios, the action would be caused that we did. In other scenarios, we could rewind back time, press play, everything else would be the same, yet history would go a slightly different way forward and a different action would be caused. That just seems like that's the classic luck objection. There it just seems like which action is occurring is random, because it's up to the probabilistic laws that the cause is governed by, which action it produces, which action the cause produces. By contrast, in the uncaused case, there's nothing but the agent herself to determine which action occurs. And how does she do that? If it's uncaused, just by performing it. There's nothing else that she needs to do. So there doesn't seem to be any clear way in which she wouldn't have control over her action. I do think... Sorry, Juana, after you.
I was going to say, can't the agent causalist say a lot of what you're saying and say, well, yeah, there's nothing besides the agent herself that's causing the action?
Good. And here I think is the dirty little secret about non-causalists. I think a lot of them want to be agent causalists for the very reason that you suggested. You read contemporary non-causalists, and a lot of the vocabulary in which they write in, I think I'm guilty of this myself, is almost an agent causal vocabulary, because agent causalism seems highly attractive because the agent herself as a thing is causing her action when she acts freely. So then what's the real difference between the non-causal position and the agent causal position? My sense is this, that non-causalists are thinking to themselves, we can have everything we want. We can have everything an agent causalist needs. There's just no need to posit this extra relation between the agent herself and the action. We both want the same thing, and we both can secure the same thing. The difference is, for the non-causalist, I, as a non-causalist, am able to say the sort of causation that occurs in the world is the sort of causation that always occurs in the world, event causation. There's no need for anything special. By contrast, the agent causalist is trying to secure free will by positing a sort of relation, causal relation, that only obtains, at least in the standard agent causal model, in the case of free action. I think a lot of non-causalists they want to be agent causalists. They're sympathetic to agent causalism. And if they could make sense of agent causalism as a view, they might even gravitate towards it. But in a way, they don't think it's needed, because they think we can have everything we want in terms of agential control, the issue we've been talking about, just by virtue of the causal relation being absent. We don't need to posit the presence of a special one in order to secure it. So I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Like an Occam's razor type argument.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the right way. Why would you want to posit, and that, of course, I'm thinking of this from a non-causal perspective, but why would you want to posit the existence of a sort of special causal relation, one that bears between an agent as a substance and an action, if you didn't have to have it? And I think the non-causalist is saying we can have all the same stuff we want, which is control over our action when we act freely, without having to posit such a relation. Now, true, there's an expense on the non-causal part, which is that we have to countenance that the world will consist of uncaused events, uncaused actions. But that might be something that's in fact true. We just don't know it yet.
Are there any other potential challenges that you see for non-causal libertarianism that would be worth mentioning here?
I think in terms of challenges, there are three main ones, really. We've discussed a number of them, actually. But just to finish, and it's nice to finish with stuff that makes your view difficult. So first as we've been discussing most recently, the challenge about control, which is that how can you have control over an uncaused event? And we've given some suggestions as to how that might be so. Second, there's the challenge back to Davidson and Mealy that you mentioned earlier, which is about acting for reasons. How can you act for a reason if the reason doesn't cause the action? And there we've discussed a little bit about how there might be some other kind of relation between the reason and the action, a teleological one rather than a causal one. The other challenge, two challenges I think that at least as a non-causalist a little bit strike me as tough are these. First, there's a challenge of action per se, which is that a lot of philosophers of action, even if these are not philosophers who work particularly on free will, they just work on basic questions about action, will argue that what makes an event an action, as opposed to a mere happening, is that the event is caused in a certain way. They don't mean that a question about what makes an action free. They just mean that what makes an event an action in the first place, as opposed to a mere occurrence. Yeah. They'll say that it must be the event is caused in a certain way. And of course, non-causalists can't allow that. So they have to come up with a non-causal account of just acting per se. What makes something an action as opposed to a mere occurrence, if not that the event were caused? You've got to come with a non-causal account of that. The final objection, I think, that it bothers me, and this is again one we've touched on, is just that sense that uncaused events in the world seem inexplicable. It seems that it violates a principle that many people hold dear, which is that all events have an explanation, and perhaps even a causal explanation. Of course, we've talked about some ways to respond to that, that while it may be true that all events have an explanation, it might not be true that all explanation is causal. There might be other kinds of explanation out there. My own sense as someone that's sympathetic to the non-causal view is that none of these challenges have been fully answered. I still think there's a lot of work to do on the non-causal view, but that's part of the reason I'm interested in it. I like to see to what extent we can sort of rehabilitate minority views in philosophy, at least to give them the due that they might have.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, David. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
More than welcome to. Thanks for the discussion. If you go to the University of Tennessee homepage, you'll find me on there. In particular, my extremely cheaply produced Google website, which has some links to my papers. So I'm always interested in people's feedback. Thanks for the discussion.
Well, thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thank you again. And our next episode, we'll be talking about free will skepticism. And our guest will be Greg Caruso, who is professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning and honorary professor of philosophy at Macquarie University.